I would like to introduce to you Catrina, Fenton. There she is. I'm so glad also that you could make it to Norway. I listened to you, thank you, in Rome 2 years ago, I think. Yes. After I thought, well, we just have to get the Heritage Seed Library to Norway and to listen to your experiences. It's the oldest community seed bank in Europe, and lots of experiences. And Catrina has been behind it for many years. So please welcome Catrina with a big applause.
While we do this, do you want to stretch or stand? Feel free to tap your face, whatever you need.
Your neighbor.
Okay. Are we all awake?
Very awake. Very much awake.
So, hello everyone. Tusen tack. Thank you very much. That's it. That's all I know. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is my first time in Oslo, first time in this country, so I've been made to feel very welcome. So thank you very much. I'm hoping over the next 40 minutes or so you're going to get a real feel for what we do, why we do it, how we do it, and some insight into the way we operate, some of the practicalities for us as a community seed bank at Garden Organic. I thought I'd set the scene with this first image. This is just a few of quite a large collection of seed packets that were donated to us a few years ago. They're all 19th century seed packets. They were found in a safe in a big old country estate. They were probably all developed by the head gardener of the estate. They're all beautifully folded. Sadly, the seed's not viable. Most of them are melon varieties for some reason. But the reason why I've included it is really just to illustrate that at one time, people did not just go out and buy packets of seeds. There was a whole culture behind perhaps breeding your own varieties, valuing the ones that you had grown and saving those seeds and being able to share them. They're lovely, we have them in our office, and they're just a great reminder of the tradition and skills and reason for being behind what we do today. So what about the Heritage Seed Library? Stephen showed us a lovely picture of Lawrence Hills. I have another one, this time with a hat on. We came about in the early 70s, 1975, in response to changes at the time around seed legislation. So we joined the European Economic Community. We might be leaving it at some point. We're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about that. And at the time, what happened was a change in laws around marketing of seeds. And essentially, this new legislation came in. Costas has briefly mentioned the cost of it, which meant that for varieties to be allowed to be sold legally, they had to make their way onto a national list and a wider European common catalogue. And for many growers, and Lawrence Hills realised this early on, many varieties were going to start disappearing as a consequence. Either because they were not going to make it through much more stringent tests around distinctiveness, uniformity and stability, so a lot of heterogeneous material might not have made it onto those tests, but more likely simply the cost of maintaining varieties on a commercial listing was simply not going to be viable for many growers. And we think since the 1970s, and certainly over the last century, hundreds, if not thousands, of vegetable varieties, which might otherwise have been freely traded, no longer exist. They became unavailable to growers, and Lawrence Hills, founder of Garden Organic, decided he needed to do something about it. So, in fine tradition at the time, he wrote to national newspapers, he started getting a groundswell of interest, and the collection started really as a kind of a living sanctuary, vegetable sanctuary, but as it developed, there was a realisation that actually we needed to get people growing these varieties again. So what we have in the collection, they're all open pollinated varieties, no F1 hybrids. So with a bit of care, anyone can save their own seed and grow it again. Our collection consists largely of European varieties, but some further afield. And we loosely divide them up into three categories. True heritage or historic varieties. So these are perhaps varieties that you could find in a book somewhere. So the oldest variety we have in our collection is a broad bean, a field bean, a Vicia faba, that would have been quite a staple in medieval times. It's called Martock bean. It comes from Martock in Somerset, which is in the southwest of England. And the earliest descriptive records that we've found on it on manorial rolls date back to about 1293, 1294. Most of our collection is definitely not that old. We've got a few, 16th, 17th century carrots and bits and pieces, but the large majority of our collection dates from the 18th, 19th and 20th century. The vast majority of our collection is made up of what we call heirlooms. So these could have been commercial varieties once. Uncle Fred down the road swore by these peas, found he couldn't buy them anymore. They're now called Uncle Fred's peas, and he's been growing them for generations. A lot of varieties are named after people, uncles and aunties and grandparents, for places, traditions associated with those. And they do make up a very large portion of our collection. And finally, we have our ex-commercial varieties. So they might not be quite as old. It's been mentioned, what is an old variety? Well, for us, if it's dropped off that commercial listing 2 years ago, that's an ex-commercial variety that we would be interested in having in our collection. And there are ways that we can do that. We keep an eye on our national lists. We keep an eye on the European Common Catalogue. Sometimes we get a couple of years' notice, and we might go out and try and obtain that seed before it becomes no longer available, so that we can bring it into our collection. We like ex-commercial varieties. Lots of seed merchants disappeared from the 1970s and beforehand. And we're very fortunate to have a small collection of old seed packets. They're great. I love seeing seed packets from the 1940s and 50s. The graphics, the images are brilliant. Of course, they're a visual-ish example of what those varieties might have looked like. So from a referencing point of view, they're really good. We have that with seed catalogues, 19th century, early 20th century varieties. This year, for example, we're growing a variety of pea from Carter's. That's an old seed company, but we've got their 1931 catalogue. So we've got a picture of the 1931 version of the seed that we're growing this year. So it's really useful for us to have that. Of course, as an organisation, we developed and realised that, again, we needed to keep these growing, so we moved away from simply growing them in a space, saving the seed, to making these available to our members. So by the 1980s, we became a membership organisation that could be truly recognised. And we currently have around 800 varieties in our collection. These are all vegetable seeds. We grow for seed. They're all orthodox seeds, so they respond well to drying and cooling, the means of preserving them. We don't do fruit trees. We don't do anything beyond that. We don't do cereals. But there are other national collections that do that. The collection expands and contracts all the time. So as I mentioned, the seed regulations, at the time, all of those 800 varieties are not commercially listed. So it is not legal for us to sell the seed. We don't do it. Sometimes, some varieties in our collection get taken up commercially. That's kind of a success. It comes out of our collection. Somebody else is maintaining it. We can move on to the 50 or so that we have in a queue that we're waiting to assess to bring back into the collection. But half the seed we grow is grown on site. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that and some of the kind of practicalities that many of you who are doing community seed banks may already be experiencing. But half the seed, we depend heavily on a network of volunteer growers for us. So our seed guardians, we call them, about 170 of them. We just couldn't do what we do without voluntary help to get this organisation working. As I mentioned, the seed isn't for sale. So the way that we organise ourselves is that we are a membership organisation. We are a registered charity, and our members cannot buy the seed, but they pay an annual fee to support the work we do, and in return, once a year, they get one of our fantastic seed lists, which is due out in December, of which there will be 150 or so of our 800 varieties for them to choose from. They can choose 6 packets, plus a little dip, and that is their seed allocation for the year. Interestingly, although we're the Heritage Seed Library, we're part of Garden Organic, which is a bigger charitable organisation. So Garden Organic itself has about 20,000 members, and the charity Garden Organic was established back in 1958. Of those 20,000 members, about 6,000 of them are members of the Heritage Seed Library. So they pay an extra small membership charge on the top of their membership to Garden Organic, and they support the work we do by doing that. Interestingly, only about 3,500 of our 6,000 members choose to access our seeds from our seed library. So many of them are supporting the work we do purely for the cause, for us rediscovering varieties, for us conserving those varieties, and for them to be making them available again. So our model, it's a different model from the one that we've been talking about, the other models that we've been talking about. And our audience is largely the home grower. So we're talking about packets of seeds that people would expect to have seen from seed merchants or places that they can buy them. We're not really servicing an agricultural level. And the seed that we produce is on a very small scale. So we don't have standard seed packets. If you go to a shop and buy a packet of pea seeds, you might get 50 seeds. We can spare you 10. And when it's gone, that's it. Hence, we only ever have about 150 available to members each year. So, here's a little bit about how we do it. So this is our site at Ryton, where we grow half of the seed we grow. We're a very small team, although we're part of a slightly bigger team at Garden Organic. So I'm the only full-time member at the Heritage Seed Library. And I have 2 part-time horticulturists. Hallie's one of them here. And we have 1 seed officer who's responsible for coordinating all seed processing. And we have 1 information officer who's responsible for coordinating all our seed guardians and the provenance and the research information behind each of our varieties. So it's quite a small setup, really. And obviously we're supported by Garden Organic, and within that we have a finance team, a communications team, and personnel support team. But in terms of our operations, we're very much doing this on a small scale with a small team. We have about 10 volunteers who come and see us on site. They can spare us anywhere between a couple of hours to a day a week. Again, we couldn't do what we do without them supporting us to do this. So in terms of seed production, I mentioned our 170 seed guardians. We tend to handle the trickier stuff on site ourselves. So I'm talking about things that require some kind of isolation to remain true to type. I think the one thing that makes us a little bit different from other organisations we've been talking about is that we are not into breeding varieties at all. We are very much all about conserving as much as we possibly can that 1930s pea or that 1920s cabbage, or something along those lines, and keeping it as true to type as possible. So there are 2 things that we really need to do. One is to make sure varieties don't cross-pollinate, and the other one is to only save seed from the very best examples of that particular variety. So there's a lot of work that goes into referencing back to see that varieties are what we think they are, but also to make sure that we're not creating something that isn't that 1930s pea. So a lot of our growing space is involved in isolating our crops. So every year we are driven by the need to replenish that core library seed sample from our 800 varieties. And if you can imagine, they all have different shelf lives because they're all different vegetables. It's a very big database. I feel the pain when we're talking about developing databases. We have a lot of spreadsheets and databases that we're trying to amalgamate at the moment. And what we try and do is grow about 100 to 120 varieties on the site. Some things are easier than others. We tend to stick to the trickier crops. So for us, a runner bean, Phaseolus coccineus, needs at least 1 kilometre isolation from another variety because bees love them and they'll transfer the pollen. And if you've got a nice shiny black seeded runner bean from Uncle Bert, you don't want the pollen transferred to a spotty one from Auntie Madge. So we have to keep them separated, and we do that. So we have 9 polytunnels on site, they're all meshed. We keep them isolated that way. And we also have, for things like broad beans, Vicia faba, again, at least 1 kilometre distance. And we're talking maybe about growing 5 or 6 different varieties of those each year to maintain that fresh shelf life for our port library, for example. So there's various things that we do. We isolate them. We had some mixed efforts with tomatoes. Most tomatoes will happily self-pollinate without cross-pollinating, but there are, especially amongst heritage varieties, flowers with exposed stigma, where again there's a risk of transfer of pollen. So we do a lot of faffing about in polytunnels trying to isolate varieties. Of course, if you isolate them, then somebody's got to pollinate them. And if you don't want the insects to pollinate them all over the place, then you've got to do it yourself. So there's a huge amount of hand pollinating that goes on. I get really bored after about 5 minutes, which is why I encourage lots of volunteers to come on site. They've forgotten how many hours they spent doing it last year by the time it comes round again, and they come and help us out with it. So the runner beans, for example, we use little paintbrushes, or we might peel off flowers and dab them around a little bit. Obviously for varieties like squashes, or any cucurbits where they've got separate male and female flowers, insects will love them. Well, we kind of take the male flower and pollinate sherbet dip around the varieties to make sure within that collection, within that single variety, to try and ensure that they don't cross-pollinate, but also ensure that we are creating a healthy genetic pool for that next generation. So we have different population sizes. So for something like a pea, easiest of all, happily self-pollinate before the flowers even open, we only grow 10 plants. That's it for that variety. That Carter's, that 1931 pea, that's it. For something like a squash, well, 6 plants, but then we are pollinating across individual plants to kind of liven up the genetics of that plant. For something like a brassica, like a cabbage, at least 100. 2 years it takes. So it's a massive commitment. And for us, our crop rotation planning, it's amazing. So for my colleague who does that every year, because we meet our Soil Association standard. So we're organically certified, and that's really important as a garden organic, part of the garden organic programme, which means that we get inspected every year, but it also means that in terms of our growing planning, we have to ensure that we rotate these crops around, accommodating all those multiple population sizes. I know, it makes you nosebleed just thinking about it, which is why I give it to someone who knows how to do it properly. But back to the pollinating. We have these lovely friends here. Some things we just can't hand pollinate because the flowers are too small, or they're too abundant, or they're self-incompatible, so we need a lot of movement of pollen around. So we visit a local angler shop, fishing shop, every year, and we buy maggots. That will turn into flies for us. It might be something that you already do. I know it smells terrible when we do it. You don't want them to escape. They have. It's a terrible thing when that happens. But they do the job for us. They're not as effective as bees, but technically, trying to manage a community of bees in polytunnels and work safely with them and not let them starve, it's quite difficult to do. But these happy flies, they have a lovely time. They pupate into casters. We take them out of the polytunnels. They have a wonderful summer with their friends, and they hang out and move pollen about for us. And it's a really effective and cheap way of doing it. So if you are a community seed bank that needs to isolate but pollinate, I don't know how much they cost in Norway, but it's like £3 a half litre, something like that. €3.5 a half litre, if you can translate that into your currency. And we use probably up to 10 litres a year, something like that. Something that we do. We're not just about growing that static variety and growing for seed. That's very important for us to maintain that collection. But as I mentioned, our collection is expanding and contracting all the time. And at the moment, When I first joined, we had about 150 to 200 varieties in a queue waiting to be assessed. We've done a lot of work over the last couple of years to get that down to about 50. But when we grow for trial, to consider whether we're going to add something into our collection, and again you will need to consider your own protocols as a community feedback. What is it you're collecting? For us, we're kind of quite clear. We want them to fall into those three categories: historic, heirloom, ex-commercial. More than half of the things we get donated don't even get past that point. They're synonymous with something else. They're clearly a commercial variety. There's not enough information about them. If they get to the point where we're growing for assessment, that can take 3-4 years to get to that point, given our crop rotation and our requirements to do that. Then we will measure everything we can possibly measure on them. So if you can imagine, for some heirloom varieties, they've never been formally described in any way before. So we will check them against colour charts. We will measure how many peas per pod, how many pods per plant, etc., etc. And that also gives us some kind of baseline whether we can decide whether it's something special or whether it's just like X or Y, or whether in fact it's probably just a version of this commercial variety. And it's a really important part of what we do. So this year we're assessing around 13 varieties. The majority will be heirlooms. Some are some really interesting ex-commercial varieties. And if they pass that hurdle, they'll be introduced into our collection. We'll bulk up the seed. In a few years' time, they'll be out with our members to grow and enjoy. We've talked about why do we keep heritage varieties. Well, taste is quite an important part of that. Between you and me, tasted a few of them, they're a bit ropey. But they might have been really good for another reason, for longevity or for resistance to pests and diseases, etc. But knowing what they taste like is really important. So every year, when we send that seed list out to our 6,000 members, of which just over half will choose to take the seed, we also ask them to tell us what they did with that variety when they cooked it. What does it look like when it's cooked? Does it change colour if it's a pod? What does it taste like? How do they rate it? How easy or hard was it to grow? What resistances did they discover that we don't know about? And feed that information back to us. And we gather that information, that all builds up a picture of what we have in our collection. So this is kind of fairly typical. This is what this variety, we take as many pictures of it as we can. It becomes a great reference point. And of course for us, when we grow it again, we're just going to double check it is that colour flower. We haven't muddled up the packet, or there hasn't been some issue with cross-pollination, because that's what we're trying to manage with this collection. And for our 170 seed guardians, we will send out seed for them to grow for us. We always choose the easy stuff, and I'm talking peas, I'm talking tomatoes, and I'm talking French beans, Phaseolus vulgaris, common beans. That's because they have a very low risk of cross-pollinating. So if you are going to invite people to volunteer to grow things for you, how are you going to manage that quality control? We're really quite controlling as an organisation. So, I know from what Bella's said, you have a network out there growing and people can access them directly to get those seeds, which is a very successful model for us. We want those seeds to be returned to us so that we can just double check that that bean is the right colour when it comes in, there aren't any pests and diseases associated with them. And this kind of guidance information that we give to our growers helps them understand what they need to look for when they're growing varieties for it. It doesn't always work, but it's very easy for someone to write the wrong name on a seed packet. And when we have 6 growers growing one variety for us, we don't bring them in and pour them into one big bucket and then send them out to our members. We keep each batch completely separate through its entire lifespan with us. So we know which seed we sent them out to grow for us, because we will have told them which 30 varieties we need some help with. Then we will know which batch of seed we sent them to grow for us. And when it comes back, we know who grew that batch of seed that we've had in return. So if 3 or 4 years down the line, one of our members gets that packet of seed from one of our growers, and it's completely wrong, looks nothing like this, we've got some kind of reference point to run back into the cold store, take out the rest of the seed, decide what we're going to do with it. Usually, it heads off to heaven somewhere for the seed. We don't distribute it again, but it's a means for us to understand and manage the quality of seed that we have in our collection. Reputation is really important for us as an organisation. We're claiming all sorts of things about us preserving heritage varieties. If they're growing something that looks nothing like they know what it should look like, then that's a liability for us. This isn't a very good picture, but we germination test as well. So our shelf life of seed is really important. We can risk it with the core library seed sample. So every year we grow for seed, we take out maybe 400 seeds. That's our insurance policy for that variety. We capture that. Anything we grow over above that, and hopefully we grow a lot more than that for some varieties, goes into our cold storage for future distribution to our members. So it might be 3 years, 4 years, depending on what it is, 6 years before that seed is released back out to our members. But we want to make sure that the quality, the germination rate is good. There are industry standards. We generally try and exceed those. So for most things, we want to make sure we've got at least 90% germination, if not 100%. We do all the seed cleaning ourselves, and the real message we try and get across with our training courses, which I'll talk briefly about, which is an important part of what we do. You could go into your average kitchen and pick up all the equipment you need to save your own seed, and that's an important message that we'd like to try and get across. We do dry seed cleaning, so podding, anything that just requires some abrasive. We just want to take the seed away from the chaff, the rest of it that we don't need. For our members, they expect a good quality of seeds. They don't want it full of dust and everything else, so we try and work really hard on that. We use wet methods, so something like squash, obviously you just clean the seed off. We use a fermentation method for tomatoes, very effective. You can just smear tomatoes onto a piece of tissue paper, but that is not what our members expect. So we get through about 20 varieties each year, of which we might clean 3,000 to 4,000 tomatoes by hand with our volunteers with a whole load of jam jars. So if you were to go down to our drying room now, we're probably peaked with tomatoes. We are sick to death of tomatoes. We've pretty much finished. There's an awful lot of tomatoes on the staff table, because they're great, of course, because you get to eat most of the tomato, unlike a pea or a bee. But we have an awful lot of jam jars on our shelves to do that. And because that's what people have been doing for hundreds, if not thousands of years, to clean their seed. We do have a little bit of technology. That machine on the top right-hand side is a winnower. It will help finish off some of our seed production. We're not averse to a bit of a homemadeness as well. So this is that crop in there is an Amaranth, one of our less traditional crops that we have in our collection. We managed to get that. We did a project in 2012 working with allotments. So these are sort of public growing spaces in the West Midlands. And we looked at first and second generation immigrants who brought with them seeds that were familiar to them, that they wanted to grow in the UK. These are all local, grown to local conditions. They are new heirlooms that have been brought into our collection. We have maybe a dozen or so of those. That's just a homemade device, a combing device to help us get through some of these large quantities of seed that we produce. And we're fortunate enough to have some facilities on site. So we have a drying room, and most of our seed, once we've processed it, we leave it to dry out for as long as possible out in the field. We want to recreate the ripening process for as long as we can. But when we do bring them in, we've got a drying room. It has a relative humidity of around 15%. Will bring down the seed production, bring down the seed moisture down to under 10%, which is a good thing for orthodox seed. And then we have a cold store, which is very tiny. It's very full at the moment. We're pretty much at capacity as an organisation, but that combination of drying and cooling for orthodox seed is a perfect way of managing our collection. So in our cold store, we've probably got seed that dates back to around 2011, something along those lines, and it's good to go then. We can keep that in our store and have multiple years. We distribute. Our membership, that at Elbow belongs to Baz. He joins us for a few months every year, and he flies like nobody getting out our seed So the number of packets of seed that we need to produce is based on predicted demand. Those are about the 150 of the 800 that goes out. Our seed orders come in, they get dispatched between December and the end of February. And that is a big part of our members' benefits for being part of the Heritage Seed Library. Really important thing to think about. Really important aspect of our collection are the stories behind the varieties in our collection, however tall the tales may be. And I just brought a few examples along with me just to give you a sort of sense of what we do. So Tutankhamun P, I wonder if you can think what the story is behind them. We have several in our collection that claim to have come out of tombs. It's not true, sadly, but the story persists. And it's a great example of the 1920s, slightly cheeky, entrepreneurial tea variety that we really like, so we keep that one. Brightstone Bee, that comes from the Isle of Wight, little island off the bottom of the UK. Apparently this came off a shipwreck, and they salvaged the seed, and gave it to the local villagers, and that is now the Brightstone Bean of the Isle of Wight. And at the top there, Mr. Bounds Bean Pea, example of an heirloom pea that's something a little bit different. It was tested by the John Innes Centre, which is the pea gene bank in the UK. It's a peculiarly large pea for some reason, and they couldn't find another example that was similar to it. So it was a truly unique heirloom variety that's been developed that we have in our collection. So very precious, unusual stories. We have lots and lots about all sorts of wild and wonderful tales, and that's a really important part of our membership appeal. We only have one Norwegian variety in our collection, so I thought I'd tell you about it briefly. I don't know if any of you recognise the name, I don't even know if it's Norwegian, but the story behind it is that it was developed in the Chilean mountains specifically for growing in Norwegian's cooler climate. Purports to be blight resistant, and again that's an important part of what we have in our collection. There are lots of genetic resources. We're looking back to the past, but it is about preserving for the future parts of the collection that might prove really important in our days of climate change and all sorts of other challenges around pests and diseases. You'll be very pleased to know I have brought some seed with me. I will give it to you, Regina. So if anybody wants a pinch of it, please help yourself. Get it back growing in Norway. It's really important. We don't like to waste any of our seed either. So when that shelf life drops, we don't just dispose of the seed. We take it to seed swaps. And we support around 40 seed swaps in the UK. We know there are at least 70 or 80. It's another kind of seed network. We get those varieties out there for us. It's a marketing opportunity. We get donations back, covers our postage, and ensures that our message is out there and people can carry on and save those seeds themselves. Okay, that's fine. So that's an important part. What are you going to do with your seed when it is no longer suitable to be distributed? Do you just run out of it before that happens, or what do you do when that seed is accepted to that? It's an important part of ensuring that the effort and the time is made, which is a lot of effort and time to produce and maintain 800 in our collection, goes to a useful place in your community. One of the things that we're trying to do, really helpful for us to get our message out there, is to get those varieties growing back where they came from. About half of our collection, we know, has a geographical location just under somewhere in the UK. So a lot of our work recently has been about how do we get people to really engage with heritage varieties. People absolutely love it when they find out that there is a variety that was grown around the corner, or something that they knew their grandparents grew in a local region where they come from. Or it's named after Martock in Somerset, that broad bean. It's really important and it really captures people's imagination. So what we've been doing is working with a lot of historic gardens, for example. National Trust is a very large organisation in the UK, looks after a lot of historic properties, kitchen gardens, and we've been working with them to get varieties that are specific either to that region or to the historical period relevant to that property. So a Victorian kitchen garden will be really interested in those 19th century varieties. And we can be very specific. So, we've been looking at Wilder Beatrix Potter, for example. So we've only been looking at varieties within a few decades. But because we can provide them, they've been able to grow them in their gardens. National Trust properties we're working with at the moment have a footfall, have visitors of at least 250,000 a year. We can't reach that number of people. But if people go to these gardens because they're interested to look at vegetables grown in historic gardens and they come across our heritage varieties, goodness, they might want even to become members. And we really do need that funding to support the work we do. We are funded by membership, we are funded by donations, we are funded by legacies. We do not have government funding. We can apply for grants, some of which are funded by local authorities, the National Lottery, support the work we do. We really do need members, and our membership model is something that we work well with. And we're part of a larger charitable organisation which is also funded in this way. So again, something to bear in mind. I don't think for us to sell a packet of seed is really going to work with the work that we're trying to do. We're not growing in large enough quantities for that to really be viable at this stage. So here's an example of a project, very briefly. A couple of weeks ago, I went to Manchester, which is sort of northwest of England, to work with this community group. So this is a local volunteer community network who had applied for Heritage Lottery funding to work with their client group, who are young adults with special educational needs. And what they wanted to do was to teach a new generation how to grow vegetables, to learn about the market gardening history of their local area, which was particularly strong, but also to access varieties that are relevant to that local area. So we were being able to do two things. One, we could provide them with some heritage seed from our collection. So Cliff Runs was a local seed merchant who grew this particular tomato. George Potts was an heirloom person called George Potts who developed this variety. Altrincham is a misspelt but version of the local town that it came from, these carrots came from. They absolutely love these carrots because they grew so well in their local soil growing conditions, because that's where it came from. And they had fantastic, they'd never grown such wonderful carrots. And Simply Wonder, which is now coming out of our collection because it's synonymous with a commercial variety, but could be grown by them as a show variety. The second thing that we did was we were able to provide seed-saving training. So we have a portfolio of basic courses. We start off with the easy-peasy stuff, the peas and tomatoes and French beans, to the slightly more complicated, the biennials that require a lot of isolating, lots of maggots, hand-pollinating, whatever else you want to do. But they, in return, as well as paying for membership to become a member for us, and they'll enjoy that membership for the year, is that they also became one of our 170 seed gardeners. So for this year, they are growing tomatoes for seed that relate to the history and location they are working in. It has great meaning. They've been able to do more research on this variety than we can, so they'll be sending us more information back for our heritage collection. So that's just an example of the kind of work that we do. So, I'm going to stop talking and leave you with some questions. You can find out more about what we do on our website. It's the Garden Organic website, and if you follow the links to our Heritage Seed Library, you'll have a kind of outline of what we do. We have our seed saving guidelines. It's really important that we encourage people to save their own seeds, so we make them available freely for people. If you want to become a member, well, feel free. We do have European members. We've recently kind of recategorised our what we consider to be EU members, because we included European Economic Area is good enough. Bearing in mind, of course, we cannot afford to do the phytosanitary certification required to send seeds beyond that point. And I'm not even going to talk about Brexit and what that means for us, should that happen, but where there could be some restrictions in terms of movement of seed. So while you can, please feel free to join. And if you have any questions, please do ask them. That's quite all right.
And it was really very, very impressive, how you have developed this system, so detailed, how to really conserve the seeds true to variety. and multiply in such a way that you really keep on those old varieties. I already forgot the names, but you know,
Yeah.
back to the 1930s
Yes.
or even before,
Absolutely.
and so that people can continue using it and enjoying them. So, no, that's really very, very impressive.